you can't hear me, you can hear me now. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs. Hello, everybody. I hear tell there's some kind of big sporting event going on at the moment in America where my cousin, Tom Brady, might be showing up. Hello, everybody. People said I arrived abruptly onto their screens. Hello, everybody. Good to see you all. Happy Sunday night. I hope you all enjoyed the video that we got out overnight. It was the fourth part of the Evolution of Ocean Liners series. So we covered the Ile-de-France, the Bremen, and Europa. People criticizing the way that I said Europa instead of saying Europa, of course, being a German ship. And the Germans in the audience could correct me, but it, in theory, should be pronounced Europa. And then we also covered the Rex and Conte di Savoia, which were absolutely magnificent ships. So it was really good to get to talk about ships that we typically often don't get to cover on the channel. We're always talking about Edwardian liners, it feels. It was really good to get to do some ones from the 30s instead. Hello, everybody. So good to see you all. I love doing the Evolution of Ocean Liners videos because it's fun, it's upbeat, and we get to celebrate these ships from the past instead of talking about them sinking, which seems to be what we usually do. People saying it's a little bit quiet. You can hear me now. Is that better? Hopefully that's better. I've got my volume much louder. In fact, it's all the way up. There you go. Let me know if you guys think this is too loud or if this is better. Hello. Good to see you all. Yes, it's been a busy couple of weeks, but today we're not really here to talk too much about the channel. Today we're here to talk about some pretty spectacular ships with a very special guest. Before bringing our guest on, I thought I'd embarrass him a little bit with a little anecdote. I can see his face in the corner of my screen right now, reacting to this. But years ago now, I was at school. It was about 2003 or 2002. Must have been 2003. And back then, you know, like nowadays, every kid has their own computer or their own iPad. But back in 2003, we had computer lab, you know, and so we had like maybe 15 big old computers set up, and you used to be able to have like, you know, 20 minutes at lunchtime, that kind of thing. And so every lunch I would go in and just browse the internet for as many photographs or plans of ships that I could. And there was this news came out that there was some brilliant daredevil had backed the construction of a new ocean liner for the new age. And being, you know, a Titanic tragic and Queen Mary tragic, I was so excited to follow Queen Mary 2's construction as she was being built, and downloading any photograph that I could of the ship that as it was coming out. And the designer of the ship became kind of like a little, you know, a bit of a rock star. You know, Stephen was in every documentary. He's laughing now, but it's true. He was in every you know, news report about the ship, every documentary. He always spoke so passionately, and I was so excited that someone was doing this. And I dreamt of the day that I would one day get to go on the ship and also meet Stephen. You know, in the annals of naval architects and designers, Mr. Stephen Payne has to rank very highly up there. And he joins us today, live from his home in England. Mr. Payne, good to see you.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope I didn't throw you too much under the bus with our little story.
No, that as introductions go, that wasn't too bad.
You must hear that kind of thing a lot. You must have like a lot of ship nerds running up and saying, "I saw you in this documentary."
Yeah, no, that does happen quite a bit. Yeah, certainly, especially on the ship.
Yeah, you must be a celebrity on the ship.
Yeah, it's a nice feeling, I must say.
Yeah. I actually, you know, I would always wonder what it would feel like, I guess, to, you know, stroll the decks of the ship that had lived for so long on your computer and on your drawings, but I think maybe people don't fully understand the amount of work that you've done. I know Queen Mary 2 is probably regarded as your magnum opus, but Rotterdam and many ships before it. Do you want to give the audience just a brief overview of your career and just some of the highlight projects that you've worked on?
Well, I joined the Carnival group in 1985. There was a consultancy in London called Technical Marine Planning. And my first ship when I joined was the Holiday, which was just nearing completion. And she had done her first set of sea trials. And so I went off on the second set, and we did crazy things like roll the ship and do the speed runs and the maneuvering. Great fun. And then I had to spend time in the yard where we were inspecting every cabin, testing every switch, every tap, and that to make sure everything was working. So that was my first sort of baptism of fire. And then we started work on the fantasy class, which we actually did the concept design in-house. And one of my contributions to the fantasy was that on the main public room deck, high up just below the lifeboat, the boat deck, midships, there was like a bay window that stuck out from the side of the ship. And that was one of my ideas to add extra interest on those ships. And probably the most, not exhilarating, scary thing I had to do with the fantasy was that she did her sea trials in January, sailing out of Helsinki, and the Baltic had just defrosted enough so that we could get out. So it was really cold. And I had to jump down from a shell door onto the top of a tender, go round the fantasy, taking the draft readings so that we could get an accurate measurement of the ship's displacement for doing the speed runs. And because we were out on sea trials and everything hadn't yet come on board, there were no life jackets, there was no Jacob's ladder. So I literally had to jump from the shell door onto the roof of this tender and then jump back onto the ship. And it was quite a swell. And they said, well, a seaman is going to stand at the opening with his arms stretched. Somebody's going to be holding him by his waist. And you've got to judge at the right moment that the tender comes up, and then with a leap of faith, go into this guy's arms. And they said, if you happen to fall into the water, you've only got a minute or two before the cold will get to you. So that was pretty scary, I must admit. So did that, and of course, several years ago, to see the ship being run up the beach in Turkey to be scrapped, it suddenly brings home, yeah, I've had this long career doing the ships, and those early ships are now being scrapped. So it really brings home mortality and how long you've got to do things on this planet.
Yeah, well, there's something about the life cycle of ships that mirrors that of our own, because I think the ships themselves, I didn't expect to get fully existential straight off the bat, but the ships themselves kind of exist with their own personalities and their own souls, and then eventually all ships must get to the scrapyard. But did they have you in an immersion suit? Surely they would have given you some kind of like wet weather gear.
No, it was purely our overalls, which we were wearing over, our normal clothes. But there was no immersion suit. So you wouldn't be able to do it today. Health and safety would dictate that it's different. But that's how we did it.
Wow.
And of course, during the construction of that ship and the sister ship, the Ecstasy, the shipyard had gone bankrupt, Zilla Marine. And so it was under a new management with funding put in by Carnival and Royal Caribbean, because they had ships building in Turku. So, but we went on to build 8 fantasy ships, 6 standard ones, and the last 2 we changed from propellers to pods. They were the first ocean liners or passenger ships to be powered by pods. So we are very proud that we introduced that technology into the market. And then when Carnival bought Holland America, we started with the Statendam class. So I was very much involved with that. And in fact, the acquisition of Holland America, I had to go out and survey the Holland America fleet as part of the due diligence. So went on the old Rotterdam, the New Amsterdam, the Noordam, and the Westerdam that had not yet been lengthened. And in fact, Carnival wanted to stop the lengthening. They wanted to use the money for something else. But because it had all been planned and scheduled, Meyer Werft said, no, we've got to go ahead with the jumboization. So the ship was lengthened subsequently. And then after that, there was the Destiny class at Fincantieri, then the Costa Atlantica class in Wärtsilä or Massa, and then, of course, Rotterdam, which was the ship that I was project manager of, Rotterdam 6, which replaced Rotterdam 5. Great ship, and really enjoyed working on that. So it wasn't an easy ship, but worked with Fincantieri, and Loris De Giulio was the Italian project manager. So we did a lot of work together there to make that happen. And of course, she replaced Rotterdam 5. So I was very keen to see that ship have the twin funnel arrangement and certain echoes of Rotterdam, which are still on the ship as she's sailing as Borealis. And then I had started Costa Atlantica and was getting my teeth into that when suddenly Carnival bought Cunard, and I was assigned to look after the design and then the building of Queen Mary 2 that you see behind us here.
It's a great backdrop. You were very excited that you got to rig that, and I'm glad you did, because it really it's like we're there. We've already got a couple of super chats coming through from the audience. One of them will be known to you. It's Thomas Haifa. He says, "My dad found a picture from our first meeting aboard. Was it Shield Hall in September 2004? I can show you when we next meet up." From 2004. There you go. Thomas is a walking encyclopedia of ship things, and he's recently, I think, gone to sea himself, and is becoming an officer, which is quite cool.
Yeah, and I remember a photograph of him on the bridge of QE2 as well.
He knows everything about QE2, so I know when I do a video on her between you and Thomas, I'll be very well served. We also got a super chat from Daniel Berman, who asked, and he may have asked you or I, he just addressed it to the panel, which was, how would you go about designing a 4th Olympic class ship? Which I think is an interesting question, because obviously given the design evolution.
It depends if you were designing it today or if you were designing it in the sort of 1920s. Because the rules and regulations that we have to abide by today, because of what happened to Titanic, safety convention was formed called Safety of Life at Sea. It was originally going to come into force around the time the First World War started. Unfortunately, the First World War delayed it until the late 1920s. But that brought in standards of subdivision, lifeboat capacity, having a wireless system that was either constantly manned or an automatic detection when there was an emergency. And those safety rules came in 1929. Then there was a revamp in 48 where extra things were added. Then 1960 and 1974. And rather than issue the whole set of regulations as they did in 60 and 74, they now do piecemeal bits and pieces. So there's a huge raft of regulations that would really make building a real replica of Titanic very difficult, because you'd have to like enclose all the staircases, the subdivisions likely to be wrong and things like that. So if Clive Palmer, one of your countrymen, ever gets his Titanic 2 project on the go, the people who are working with him on the ship will have to abide by all these new rules and regulations. And in fact, one of them is that you cannot have any dead-end corridors. A corridor has always got to be in a loop. The reason being that in a fire where there's a lot of smoke and you're crawling around on your hands and knees, you don't want to go up a dead-end corridor thinking there's an escape and be trapped. And that was because of the deadly fire on the ferry Scandinavian Star, where a lot of people perished because exactly that happened. They were crawling on their hands and knees and got trapped. So ships like even QE2, if you're familiar with QE2, on the lower passenger decks, she had a lot of passageways that went off the main passageway and then went to various cabins. They were all dead-end corridors that wouldn't be allowed today. And of course, Titanic and Olympic had a myriad of those. So all that would have to be significantly changed.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's a huge things that would have to be done. The fire safety, fire bulkheads, as well as all the latest probabilistic damage stability rather than deterministic as it was then. And it's just incredible the change in regulations and what it means to the ships these days.
It must be. I mean, designing within constraint is difficult, but when it's so heavily regulated, obviously for good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And sadly, in a way, a lot of these regulations have come about because of accidents. A recent regulation is the safe return to port. And that came about because of some incidents on some cruise ships where they were sort of becalmed and basically the toilets didn't work and conditions on board got very, very bad. And the ship was totally immobile. Well, the safe return to port basically says that even with one fire division completely taken out of the ship, you've got to have systems in place where everything else on the ship will provide an adequate level of sanitation, catering, and that you have arrangements down below that, as far as practicable, and it's certainly not foolproof, but as far as practicable, you will still have some form of propulsion. So if you've got a diesel electric power plant, they want the diesels spread over 2 engine rooms. So if one floods, the other one will still be able to give you the power. And of course, that's one of the big advantages with Queen Mary 2, because she's got one large diesel engine room that's below the funnel, but immediately behind the funnel, there are 2 large gas turbines. So even if the diesel engine room is completely flooded or there's a fire or something like that, she's still got all the power from the gas turbines. So, she does very well in that regard.
That's brilliant, because the turbines are very similar to what you'd probably find on a commercial jet, right?
They are. They're in an acoustic enclosure, so you don't hear them at all. A lot of people say to me, how on earth can you put gas turbines at the top of the ship? Won't the cabins on the decks below suffer from the noise?
Yeah.
Well, you can't hear them because they're in a acoustic hood, and they draw the air in from the base of the funnel, and the exhaust goes up out the top. So yeah, you don't know they're there.
It's brilliant. It's such a great arrangement, and one of her design secrets, because the hood is so useful. You would have, like you say, absolutely no idea that there's such a heavy duty bit of machinery right there. You walk blissfully past it.
And a ship the size of the Queen Mary 2, we've got 120 megawatts of power installed, 85 megawatts of which goes to the propulsion pods at full power, and that's the same or more power, I should say, more power than the whole of Southampton needs, and the city where she sails from. But most of the time she only uses a fraction of that power, but it's there when it's needed to get the ship out of trouble, when the Atlantic really kicks up rough, which it does occasionally. And again, it's part of the distinction of an ocean liner as opposed to a cruise ship.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on what qualifies Queen Mary 2 as a dyed-in-the-wool cruise ship, which we'll talk about, because I would love to pick your brain on that.
Yeah, we can do that. We can discuss fees later.
We've had another couple of super chats. One from the SS Nomadic, presumably not the ship herself, which says, "Opinion on the greatest ship ever," and then in brackets SS Nomadic. I feel like in law they'd call that leading the witness.
Well, I've been on her as well in Belfast.
Yeah, she's pretty spectacular job, that restoration job.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm gonna greatest ship ever. I know it's the topic of our conversation today, but I think Queen Mary for me has got to embody everything that a liner can do and be. Troop ship, just unbelievable career, absolute star of her time.
Yeah, well, in June, when you come to the lecture Genesis of a Queen, you'll get my take on that.
So that was the plug. Everybody listening, we've got close to 500 right now. We'll give them some details, and we'll see. I do have to say, actually, so I got to see you talk in Red Hill, and
of course you did.
Yeah,
of course I forgot that. Of course you did.
So I have like a bit of an inkling as to where you're leaning, but anybody who gets the opportunity to see where Stephen's talking, absolutely do it, because it's such an entertaining talk. You're so good at taking these concepts and getting them across in a way that is easy to follow if you're not necessarily like au fait with things like hull coefficient and that kind of thing. But it actually leads us into another super chat. Brandon Meyer very, very generously has given us $100. So thank you very much, Brandon. That's very, very kind of you. He says, "Thank you, Mike and team, for this amazing interview opportunity. Huge thank you to the iconic Stephen Payne for his role in designing Queen Mary 2. Any chance we can hear some stories about the sea trials on Queen Mary 2? Any highlights, her speed achievements, and the emergency stop?"
Yeah, well, we always tend to do the sea trials in the middle of the night, and that was very much the case with Queen Mary 2. And we'd had the first sea trial where we achieved about 29.3 knots, but that was with a dirty hull. So after that first sea trial, we went back to San Jose, scraped off all the weed, and the hull was freshly painted. And that's the sort of condition that you do the speed runs. And there was a lot of anticipation, and we achieved 29.62 knots, which is 0.3 of a knot over the contract speed. And 0.3 of a knot doesn't sound very much, but it equates to an enormous amount of power at the higher end of the speed. So in reality, the ship did extremely well. The shipyard, to their credit, we did a lot of model tests in Holland at the model base and at Marin, in Wageningen near Arnhem, where there was the bridge too far battle.
Right.
That is where most of the passenger ships are tested in model form. And they all did a tremendous job in refining the shape of the bulb at the front of the ship that stops the bow wave, and that leads to a higher speed.
Yeah.
But I think the best story I can tell you about a sea trial, if we got a few moments, is we were on the Mars Dam, the second Holland America ship, and we were sailing along, and Carnival had just appointed a new liaison between Mickey Harrison's office, the chairman and CEO of Carnival, and our shipbuilding office, which at the time was based in London. And I recounted to this guy, I said, on the Statendam, the previous ship, we were running down the Adriatic to do the speed runs, and you have to line the ship up on an exact course. You have to have a long lead up, so you get the maximum speed, and then you have to hold it for a certain length of time. And then you have to do a very precise, slow turn, so you come back on an exact parallel course over the same stretch of water in the opposite direction. So if there's any wind or current helping you one way, it slows you down in the opposite direction. So it's very precise that you do all this. So I'm up on the bridge on the Statendam, and we're going down the Adriatic, and suddenly we're buzzed by a number of helicopters and think this is all very odd. And then on the radio, there's this very sort of gruff American voice saying, "Get out of my way, I'm coming through." And basically, we had to take avoiding action because of an American aircraft carrier that was also going down the Adriatic in the opposite direction to us. So I recounted this to this gentleman on the Mars Dam, and he laughed and he said, "Yeah, it was me." He said, "I was the captain of the Saratoga, and we were at flying stations to launch planes for the conflict in that region." And he said, "I couldn't change course because I needed the wind over the deck to get the planes off." And he said, "On my radar, all I saw is this ship behaving very erratically, going backwards and forwards. So that's why I told you to get out my way." And that was Captain Jim Drager. So great laugh.
Brilliant.
Absolutely
hilarious.
Hilarious. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you have to do a crash stop on Queen Mary too?
Yeah, we have to do that in zigzags, and the crash stop is always great fun, especially when you're right at the aft end of the ship, because from going from like 29 knots to putting the power full astern, the raw power there bringing the ship, and normally it generates a huge plume of water at the aft end of the ship, and a lot of the ships you go on, the vibration is horrendous. There's a lot of what we call whipping, where the stern's going up and down. Queen Mary 2 is so solidly built, I must admit, it was rather a non-event. We just rapidly slowed down and then started going astern about 20 knots from what I remember. So yeah, it's just a function of again, she's built as a liner with all the strength, and she can cope with that sort of thing really well.
I think there's a huge misconception about Queen Mary 2 in the ocean liner kind of nerd community that I'm part of, where because maybe from the outside she's a very unique ship. She looks to me like an ocean liner, but because she has balconies, basically like a cruise ship, then you'll have your ocean liner purists saying things. Oh, well, she's beautiful, beautiful, but she's not a real ocean liner, which could not be further from reality. I think they completely misunderstand how much goes into designing a liner over a cruise ship.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You've got the shape of the hull, the strength, the structure throughout the ship, say the thickness of the hull, and the arrangement of the superstructure where it's concentrated amidships. Because when you think the bow and the stern of a ship, there's very little buoyancy because they're relatively fine. So if you put a superstructure right at the forward end and you have a superstructure right at the aft end, as you do with a cruise ship to get the maximum volume, there's very little buoyancy supporting all that weight. And so, in effect, that weight is being taken by the buoyancy further in the middle of the ship. And that causes a certain amount of stress in the structure. But if you then start going through waves where the buoyancy is constantly changing every millisecond, you've got a different buoyancy along the length of the ship. On a liner where you're trying to cross in really bad weather, it would lead very quickly to cracking and very much overstressing. And that's why, a ship like Queen Mary 2 cost us about 40% more to build than a cruise ship.
Yeah.
And incidentally, the ship would not have been built without the balconies that she has, because it's the proliferation of balconies. Queen Mary 2, when she was built, had a higher proportion of balconies than any other passenger ship. And it's those balconies that generate the extra revenue compared to inside and window cabins that offset the 40% premium, not only for building the ship, but the premium for operating it as well. So they're absolutely essential to the success of the ship. And my challenge was to not only design the ship with the requisite number of balconies, but to ensure that those balconies were safe. And so with Queen Mary 2, I changed the layout compared to QE2, where the QE2's public rooms were up near the lifeboats. Well, that meant if I'd have done that on Queen Mary 2, all the cabins below those public rooms would have just been window cabins. And certainly when I discussed it with Mickey, he said, well, we don't build the ship, unless you can find these balconies. So that's why I brought the public room decks down to the lowest position where passengers would be on the ship, made those two public room decks, which are decks 2 and 3, exceptionally high. So instead of 3.5 meters that you would have on a normal passenger ship, they're 4.5 meters.
Right.
And that meant that the first passenger cabin deck on deck 4 was sufficiently high above the waterline that I was confident that they wouldn't be adversely affected by the large waves. And another reason Queen Mary 2 is different to the cruise ships is that the passenger cabins in the hull have a metal wall or a bulwark rather than the glass bulwark that you normally have on a cruise ship balcony. And again, that's because of the Atlantic. And I was only confident in going to glass for the cabins in the superstructure.
But those sheltered balcony cabins in the hull are what, to me, like one of the most charming aspects of Queen Mary 2, because it's kind of like weirdly less like a balcony and more like another room. You feel like you're getting more for your money because it feels like a sunroom. When you sit out there, you're exposed to the Atlantic, but because it's enclosed, it's actually like a sitting room or something, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I a number of people have said exactly the same to
Mm.
me, that they do not find the metal bulwark as an imposition. So
No.
yeah, no, they work, and as I say, that they're the reason the ship exists.
Yeah. It's funny. I think you were talking about deck four. You wanted to make sure she was clear of weather, but deck four would have to be about the height of like Umbria from the 1880s. Umbria's boat deck.
Yeah.
Like they must have been wet ships. They must have just been in the ocean the whole time.
Well, you know, when I decided where to put the lifeboats,
Mm.
there were recommendations about the position of lifeboats, and all the modern cruise ships, the lifeboats are much lower down inside the recesses in the hulls.
Mm.
And QE2's lifeboats regularly suffered damage from water.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, we'll put our boats at the same height as QE2's. And I had to go to the British Coast Guard and speak to them about it. And they said, yep, we understand the rationale. We can allow an exception to the rule because of the service that you're going on.
Mm.
But you've got to go over to Washington and convince the US Coast Guard. Because if the US Coast Guard don't agree, then we won't be able to do it. So I flew over to Washington, met with the Coast Guard, put the plans on the table, told them about QE2 and showed them my plans. And they said, oh, you've had a wasted journey. They said, of course you can put the lifeboats up high. They said it's a no-brainer. So
Fantastic.
But while I remember it, another interesting thing with Queen Mary too, and it harks back to the earlier queens as well. The forward face of the superstructure, up here, we have the windows, and originally our Coast Guard, the British Coast Guard, said to me, we want you to put walkways in front of those windows with attachments so that you can put steel storm shutters on those windows when it gets rough. And I said, well, we've done the model tests, and with the big breakwater and the height of the hull is, over 2 decks higher than QE2's bow. I said, I'm sure even in the really bad storms that we're not going to get water going right up in sufficient quantity to break those windows. And they said, well, we want you to fit these storm shutters. And I said, well, it'll take more than 2 people to lift these into place. And of course the old queens on the winter North Atlantic run, they had these storm shutters permanently in place. And of course we couldn't do that on Queen Mary 2 because it's the observation lounge, the Commodore Club. There are some cabins there. There's the library, of course, as well, that looks out over the front. So we got round it by using the rule in the safety of life at sea that says that if you can provide an equivalent level of safety, it will be considered. And if the authorities agree, then you can do it. And so what we did, we worked out the strengths of having these metal shutters, and we increased the thickness of the glass and the number of laminations to give us the equivalent of always having the storm shutters in place by the thickness of the glass.
Brilliant. I have to admit to doing something extremely neurodivergent, which is knocking on everything when I go onto a ship.
Yeah.
And so I was in the library and I was knocking on the windows thinking, these would have to be pretty heavy duty. And the resulting dull thud when I knocked on them essentially that's the high watermark.
Yeah, that's right. But I've been on a few really rough crossings when we've had green seas going over the bow. Most of it's been deflected by the breakwater, but it's been the washing machine effect on those windows in the Commodore Club and the library. So the library is deck 8.
Wow.
So that's high up. I've also been in the Britannia restaurant, which is on decks 2 and 3, and seeing the windows on both levels being completely submerged in the waves. And of course, when that happens, the dining room goes very dark. And the first time it happened on a stormy Atlantic crossing, there was a lot of people that started screaming. I think they were envisaging the Poseidon adventure. And because the ship didn't heel over and she just kept going and the waves passed, eventually a lot of the people moved over to the windows and were sort of goading the seas to come and try its best at the Queen Mary. So that always stuck in my mind. I found that very amusing.
That's fantastic. I would have loved to have seen that. Now, we've got a program that we've sort of prepared. Really, you've done all the work. I'm just going to be hosting as we fly around some plans. I'm just going to wrap up these last of the super chats. One of them from a friend of mine, Alexius, who helps run the Discord server that we have for the community. He says, some words directed to Mr. Payne. From my own experience, the Queen Mary 2 is a wonderful masterpiece, elegant, powerful, and timeless. Thank you for bringing such an icon to life. I hope one day Mike and I can meet on her, which... actually, right next to me, I've got the little model of the first Queen Mary that Alex very kindly sent to me. He's clearly his allegiances are with Cunard line.
Well, very good. Thank you very much for the comment.
Sophie Johansson says, Mike, are you married or single? To which I say, I'm married to my work and singularly preoccupied by it. We had another super chat from my friend Jessica, which seems to have disappeared into the ether, unfortunately. Where is it? Number one fan. She says she's our number one fan. There we go. I feel like that's probably directed at you, actually, Steve. It's not so much directed at me.
Well, no, I must admit, you do pretty well.
Good to hear from you, Jessica. Thanks for joining us. It was funny on the last crossing. As the channels got, more popular, I get a little bit of the Stephen Payne treatment, where I'll have people coming up and saying, I love the channel. It doesn't happen anywhere else. It happened once on a train in London, and then on the Queen Mary, it is very much because it's such a community, and it just goes to show that there is such a space for an ocean liner because of the people it attracts. It's interesting that a lot of the people on the Queen Mary are different.
It's
mindset.
An eclectic
Yeah.
mix. You never know who's traveling. Like President Bush Senior would regularly travel on board. Rod Stewart regularly travels, and the number of famous people that use it regularly is tremendous.
That's brilliant. Great. Well, we'll roll into it. Coachu444 said, "Hi, Mike. I'm Coachu. I'm a big fan. Wanted to ask you if you've seen my research and theory about Titanic's final plunge. I've not yet had the pleasure, but I'm sure if you share the link on the Discord, I'll be able to see it." And our last super chat before we roll into our program comes from Phantom Killer Co, who says, "Hi, Mike. I love you." Phantom Killer Co, I love you back. Brilliant. So it's good that we've kind of started at the sort of the end of the story almost, because what we're going to do is wind it back to really the late 1920s, when Queen Mary 2, Queen Mary. You haven't been in the game that long. When Queen Mary was being...
I'm weathering very well.
Queen Mary the First was being plotted out. So I know you've got some points you wanted to run over. I have the plan up so that people can see. So as you're talking, I'll be able to zoom around and show people this. This is a really beautiful
Okay.
original plan that's been scanned in of Queen Mary prior to her construction. So let's start off with this plan, with the first Queen Mary, the ocean liner, and talk a little bit about her design.
Okay. Well, I want to start by prefacing comments by saying there's no such thing as a perfect ship. The reason being that a ship is a commercial enterprise there basically to make money and to pay back the investment as well as the running cost of operating the ship. And so there's always going to be a conflict between what the ship is going to offer her passengers to what she has to do on the commercial side. And the trick is to try and align those things as far as possible so that basically the passengers are happy and the shareholders of the owning company are happy. So that's the big trick. Now, the original Queen Mary, as we've said, her design started in the late 1920s. And at that time, Cunard had three disparate, completely different ships operating their express passenger ship service. There was the Mauritania from 1907 that at the time was still the fastest merchant ship in the world. She used to cross the Atlantic around 26.5 knots at that period. Then you've got the Aquitania, which was somewhat larger, half as big again as the Mauritania, but slower. She was Cunard's answer to the White Star's Olympic class. And then there was the Berengaria, which was originally the Imperator of Hamburg America line. And she was ceded to Cunard for the loss of the Lusitania. So these three ships were quite different, operated at different speeds, but they enabled Cunard to operate a weekly transatlantic service. So one ship would depart every week on the Atlantic. And what we also have to remember is that these ships would also stay in port for several days between voyages. It's not like today where the ships are in at 7 o'clock in the morning and sail at 4 or 5 in the afternoon. In those days, the ships were in port several days. And to give you an example of why that was necessary, was that the first two queens, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, didn't have a laundry. So all the laundry had to be assembled and taken off the ship, and a second set would be brought on that had come from a shoreside laundry.
I can tell you that until recently, I had probably more laundry backed up in my hamper than probably came off Queen Mary in between trips. I've just caught up. But we're talking like 20,000 napkins and things like that. Like
all the napkins, tablecloths, all the bedding, absolutely gargantuan amount of stuff that would need washing. So yeah, phenomenal thing to do. Plus all the storing, and of course the ships used a prodigious amount of fuel. So over 1,000 tons of fuel a day, the first two queens, and you couldn't pump that on board quickly. That would take a day or so to fuel up. And they also had to take fresh water on board as well. So it was a huge process.
Yeah.
But let's look at some of the features of this first Queen Mary.
Great.
And you notice one of the things is the well deck forward.
Yeah.
And To be honest, I don't know why they introduced that world deck, because what it tended to do in rough weather, water would come over the bow of the ship and would fall into that world deck and would literally destabilize the ship, because it would be several hundred tons of water. Okay, it would rapidly disperse overboard from each side, but for that short period where the water was there, it was a huge destabilizing effect. And it must be said, Queen Mary was a very, very poor ship in terms of stability.
Mm.
When the ship was first built, Cunard felt that it would be so big that they didn't need to put handrails in the corridors, passenger corridors. They felt it would be so stable. But on an early transatlantic voyage, it was so rough that dozens of people suffered injury, and they had to have a fleet of ambulances waiting when the ship arrived in port. And so they rapidly retrofitted the fitting of handrails. And it wasn't until 1958 that stabilizers were fitted to the Queen Mary. And originally they weren't going to bother, because they assumed that the ship in the late 50s wouldn't last that much longer. They had started plans for the next ship, which would have been Q3, the abortive transatlantic liner. And so they didn't initially think that it was worthwhile fitting stabilizers to the Mary. But when plans for Q3 ran into difficulty, basically because the aeroplane was taking more and more business, and Cunard realized they needed a dual purpose ship rather than just a straight transatlantic ship, that they decided to retrofit Queen Mary with stabilizers, because they knew that she would be in service for longer than they originally anticipated.
They got a good few extra years out of her. But this is going to be one of those recurring themes, is that at the risk of making assumptions when we don't have her design team and the Cunard executives to talk to about this, it seems that, first of all, you can tell they learned their lesson, because they didn't repeat this on the Queen Elizabeth, but we'll talk about that later. But second of all, this is just one of those things where it seems like, why did you include a well deck? Because that's kind of how we've always done it. You know, it's all that. I mean, Aquitania, interestingly, didn't, but there's a lot of, nor did Lusitania, come to think of it, or Mauritania.
No, that's right.
A lot of her design harkens back to the Edwardian age, the Edwardian era of liner, with the layout of, and we'll talk about it in a minute, stoke hole vents and things like that. This is just such an archaic feature to appear in an ocean liner in the 30s. It kind of, it's funny. Do you think maybe because they wanted to have a dedicated cargo handling area that was clearly demarked from passenger spaces, because we've got a lot of hatches and winches and things around here?
Yeah, but I think those decks were accessible to third-class passengers. I think the actual forecastle wasn't, but I think the well deck and the deck behind, I would imagine were open to third class.
Yeah, it's like an open promenade.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this as well the other day, with, for example, the Olympic class not having deck ladders at the end of the superstructure connecting the boat deck to A deck to B deck to C deck, because why would you need ladders? Because that's, you know, that would be linking first and second and third class. But of course, during the sinking then, no one could get to the boat deck easily from the stern of the ship. They had to climb over the cranes and things like that. But it's just the way they'd always done it.
Yeah.
So interesting. So that has a destabilizing effect on her bow in rough weather. Do you think then as well, if they had enclosed this and actually just had a similar to Aquitania, just a solid forecastle running back to the superstructure, she would have then, I guess it depends on the numbers, but then pitching would have been reduced significantly because she essentially would have had more buoyancy forward?
They would have designed the hull to provide extra buoyancy, to support the weight of having the enclosed deck. That's what I would assume. So, but certainly having it completely flat would if the pitching would still be there because that's induced by the waves, but it's the destabilizing effect making the ship roll by having the extra weight up there, forcing the ship to roll rather than bringing the bow down.
Right. So purely by shipping temporarily a couple of 100 tons of water that high up on the hull, I mean, that's A deck, you're going to have more rolling, which she was notorious for.
She was notorious, so it exacerbated her poor rolling characteristics.
Yeah, she could roll the milk out of a cup of tea, they said.
That's it. And in fact, you see Queen Mary wasn't the only ship. I've seen pictures of like Normandy in a rough sea, and she's almost at 45 degrees. It's incredible. When we test the stabilizers, the most I've ever got up to is about 20 degrees, and that is frightening. And we always get telephone calls from the galley to say, please stop, because everything is falling off the stoves and the crockery and everything like that. So I can't imagine what it would have been like at about 45 degrees.
Yeah, and there's that famous story where she took that monster wave, and I think the inclinometer registered something in excess of 50 degrees. She was carrying tens of, over 10,000 men.
And in fact, one of her passengers was the author Paul Gallico, and he was so traumatized by being on the ship in a bad storm that he wrote Poseidon Adventure,
which is eventually filmed aboard
Queen Mary.
It's such a great loop, that story.
Absolutely. So what a sort of strange turn of events that is. So
yeah. So I mean, I know they tested this hull extensively in tanks, which is interesting. They did so much tank testing with models. Why do you think they didn't pick up on these kind of behavioral quirks before she went to sea?
I would imagine that the model testing in those days was much more primitive, because when we do it now, we have a untethered, it's a free sailing model,
right,
with sensors inside the model. So I don't think they would have had that in Queen Mary's day. I think it would have been tethered, and certainly the instrumentation on that wouldn't have been the small electronics that we have today, measuring all the different parameters. But the other thing is the center of gravity. The stabilization of things must have been that she had a higher center of gravity than what were they originally envisaged.
Amazing.
Because that is what causes the roll, is having a high center of gravity.
Can you explain just briefly? I know that there's a balance that passenger ships have to strike where you can have a long, slow roll or a quick, snappy one.
Yeah.
What kind of goes into designing the ship to achieve maximum passenger comfort?
Well, obviously, the big parameter that you've got to play with that affects the rolling is the beam of the ship, the width. And of course, the wider you go, the more expensive the ship's going to be. And in fact, although it's not noticeable, even Queen Mary 2, she's 41 meters on the waterline, but on the boat deck, she's only 40. So we have half a meter of tumble home between the waterline and the boat deck.
Right.
And that's purely there to save weight.
Mm-mm.
and cost. The yard said to me, or the ship as I designed it had 40 meters, and they said to me we would be more comfortable having the extra stability by going to 41. And ultimately they were responsible by contract to provide the stability and the speed and everything. So I was only too happy to agree. But when you've got a wide ship and you've got what we call a high GM, which is the margin of stability from the center of gravity to the pivot point, which is very important, GM. If it's too high, you get a very snappy, as you said, the ship comes back like a rocket and can be very uncomfortable as well as dangerous if it's excessive. Or you have a very low, gentle roll that people don't tend to feel so much. So it's and it depends, of course, how you load the ship as well, because as you use fuel, you've got to replace that fuel that's low down in the ship, because that provides a stabilizing effect.
There's so much consideration goes into it. It's
a huge amount.
So
shall we move on?
Yeah, that's right. I knew this was going to be the problem. I knew I'd end up asking you a million questions.
So let's look at the forward funnel area. So first off, you see that the funnel is not self-supporting. It's held in place by all those guy wires. And of course, they obstruct the deck. So one other interesting thing, and you can just see it on your plan there, Mike, it says the rake of the funnel is 1 7/8 inches per foot.
Yep.
If you now go to the second funnel, it's 1 15/16 inches per foot. And the stern funnel, or our funnel, is 2 inches per foot. So when you look at the ship, you may think that the three funnels have the same rake, the same angle, but in fact they don't. They're all at different angles, but it was designed specifically to give the most aesthetic and pleasing effect when you look at it.
It looks like she's raring to go, because they're also getting smaller, interestingly, which is that a play on perspective, that if viewed from the front, it might make the ship look bigger because the rear funnel is smaller.
Yeah. Now, the other thing, grouped around each funnel, you've got these huge intakes, vents, and we call these cowls, COWLS. And they were the intakes for the air going down to the boiler rooms. The smaller ones would have been bringing air into the accommodation. But you see along the length of the ship, there's a proliferation of these vents. And okay, they look very pretty. You look at, you compare or look at Mauritania, and she had a veritable forest of cows along her length. But what you've got to imagine is that from each one of those cows, port and starboard, you've got a great big trunk going down throughout the ship. And so this is taking up space within all the accommodation areas, making the arrangement of the decks that much more difficult. And it also presents an enormous maintenance problem, because these are ducts manufactured from steel. Okay, they'll be painted, but in the salt spray, salt-laden air, that's being drawn down into the boiler. It's a tremendously corrosive environment. And so it would have been a constant battle against corrosion to keep all these trunks in good condition.
You can actually see it here. So this is the I think the boat deck or the promenade, the upper promenade deck, the sun deck, where there's essentially vents every, I don't know, 20, 30 feet.
Yeah,
Probably not so much a problem on this deck because it's open decking, but then of course when you get below here, you've got passenger decks and.
well, you've got the public room decks, and then below that you've got the cabin decks. So you've got to squeeze in the arrangement of the cabins to avoid, interfering with all those vents. So you would place the vents first and the staircases, and then you would, after that, do the arrangement of the cabins.
Designing around it. And that naturally was something that designers had to do anyway, because you've got, of course, 3 functioning funnels. So you've already got your boiler uptakes going straight through the middle of your big public rooms.
That's right.
You have to,
and then behind that,
you've
got another big uptake for the engine hatch.
Yeah.
Which was there to lift out parts of the machinery in case you needed to. We don't do that today. We enclose everything, and if we need to take stuff out of the ship, we cut a hole in the side of the ship. And in fact, the Statendam, the first Holland America ship we were building, a few months before her delivery, one of the inboard diesel engines self-destructed, suddenly oversped and broke up, throwing bits of metal everywhere. And we had to dismantle the garbage room on the deck above, take out the deck. Then we had to cut a hole in the side of the ship, remove the good engine that was the outboard one, dismantle and scrap the inboard engine, bring a new one in, replace the outboard one, replace the deck, and then all the garbage equipment.
Big job.
Absolutely.
Right off the bat.
So
amazing.
So could we just go back to that deck,
yeah.
Mike? Just one more thing to point out are the expansion joints. And you can see on the deck there, along the length, there's an expansion joint. And what this is a cut across the deck, an opening that would be covered with a rubber gasket with a sliding, usually a brass plate on top. And as the ship flexed in the waves, rather than having cracks forming through overstressing in the superstructure, the ship would actually move apart and create a gap, which the rubber gasket would fill. And then as the gap closed, the rubber gasket and the brass plate would move backwards and forwards across the deck. And you see these early ships have these expansion joints all along the length of the ship. And of course, Titanic had expansion joints. The Elizabeth did, but QE2 didn't. And she also had an aluminium superstructure, whereas these early queens were all steel. And QE2 suffered horrendous structural problems right from the word go, with cracks forming. And by that time, it was assumed that the knowledge of structures was sufficient, that they knew what they were doing. But clearly, there were still things to be learned. And of course, computers were still very much in their infancy. Whereas today, we use very complex computer modeling to work out the strengths, and we can add structure where we know places are going to be overstressed. That's why Queen Mary 2 doesn't have any expansion joints.
Yeah, it seems like QE2 was an important you know, that the stopgap kind of like that guinea pig stage where you have to test this technology out and or this
Yeah,
style of design.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And of course, she was fully welded,
Mm,
whereas the earlier ships that had the aluminium superstructure, they were part riveted.
mm,
And nowadays, if you have aluminium in the superstructure, you explosion bond. So you actually merge the steel and aluminium together. In QE2's days and Canberra, Oriana, Rotterdam, United States, you had an isolating gasket between the two metals so that you didn't get the battery effect of two metals together
mm.
corroding very quickly. It forms corrosion. So,
And then
yeah,
they suffered, I know, aluminium superstructures a bit of a blow with, I think it was Michelangelo that shipped that monumental wave, right? That
yeah,
stove in essentially this forward section of her superstructure.
that's right. That's right.
Um, did that? I'm sorry, I know we're getting a little bit away, but it's important to talk about because I think here, for example, on the sun deck and actually the deck below the observation bar where that is, you've actually got a section there's like a buffer zone of superstructure between the public room and the outside. Um, you know what? Obviously, this is a part of the ship that's going to be taking a lot of punishment. As you said on Queen Mary 2, you had to make sure that your windows were as strong as storm shutters. Um, After the Michelangelo incident, and obviously all the problems that the other ships have had with superstructures, did the kind of concept of the aluminium superstructure die out? Were designers moving away from that concept in future ships, or was it? Did they
No, not
reinforce
really.
that?
I think a lot of from what I remember, the princess ships um, had a lot of aluminium in their superstructure, and that we tended in Carnival not to go down that route,
Mm,
but it's not used so much now because of the cost.
mm,
And you also have to have special working arrangements in the yard so that it doesn't contaminate. If you're working with aluminium, you have to take special precautions to contain any not fibers but shavings and everything that will contaminate the steel.
yeah, yeah. It's again all those things that you have to consider that the every person wouldn't realize. Somebody
Yeah,
asked, I think the name was Raphael. They asked where do the expansion joints actually begin and terminate? But essentially, we can see
they
it on the plan.
terminate on the Queen Mary. I think they terminate on that promenade deck.
Yeah, because essentially you've got. I like to describe it as you've got the hull, which is the actual structural member of the ship, and then you can essentially place a superstructure on top to
That's it.
function
Yeah,
independently, and that's why they're so lightly built. Which is why, for example, on the Titanic wreck, you can see that what's collapsing is the superstructure because it's so thin. You can see it's being eaten
yeah,
through, whereas the hull it seems to be in very good condition because it's quite thick plating. Um, so it's interesting the design ethos of Queen Mary by the time she comes around. That now designers that have now well and truly moved away from boats actually on chocks on the deck. We've now got gravity davits, which are obviously a huge step forward in safety at sea. And in fact, they're not
yeah.
too dissimilar to what you'd find on ships like Queen Mary 2 today, no?
Well, we now have to fully enclose all the boats.
Mm,
These are open boats, and only I think two of them had an engine. So
mm.
all these boats have hand called Fleming gear, where the passengers have to rock handles inside backwards and forwards to turn the propeller.
Yeah.
So these are not motorized. So they are still quite primitive.
Yes. But the davits themselves,
The
the
davits themselves are a much better arrangement. Yeah,
yeah.
gravity davits. So they come down, brought down to the deck by gravity, obviously under control with a winch, and then allowed to go down to the waterline. Yeah.
One of the things that's apparent when you visit the Queen Mary, I have to say, I was a little bit underwhelmed by the size when I went to see her, and it's probably because I've been spoiled by having got to be on Queen Mary 2, because you have a hull and then superstructure about as tall as the hull on Queen Mary 2. Whereas Queen Mary, she's very much in the style of the transatlantic Greyhounds, where she's got a very long, essentially thin hull and a tiny superstructure on top.
Yeah. Well, we measure passenger ships by gross tonnage, which confuses a lot of people because it's nothing to do with weight.
Yep.
It's a volumetric measurement, and it originates from putting beer barrels inside the holds of ships. And a beer barrel, in old terminology, was called a tunny, and that's where we get the word ton. And up until fairly recently, it was 1 ton was 100 cubic feet of space inside the ship, earning capacity. You had to measure every space and do the calculation. So because it was open a lot to interpretation, it's now been standardized to a formula where you use lengths and breadths and various things. And it gives, obviously, not exactly the same figure as it would have done if you'd have measured it, but it is a rough indication, and that's what we use now to determine the size of ship. So the original Queen Mary was 81,000 gross tons. Titanic was 45,000 gross tons, so she's almost twice the size of the Titanic. But Queen Mary 2 is 150,000 gross tons.
One of my favorite Queen Mary 2 facts is that she and Queen Mary share, I think, it's a very similar displacement of around about 80,000 tons, which is weight of ship sitting in the water, right? How much water it displaces.
It's the weight of the ship when you put it on your bathroom scales.
Brilliant. And this is a great demonstration of this fact, of this information you're saying, because although Queen Mary and Queen Mary 2 essentially weigh a similar amount, Queen Mary's gross registered tonnage is essentially half that of Queen Mary 2. So you've just got more space inside of this hull, more ship, but it weighs the same, because of course Queen Mary, you've got this unbelievably comprehensive steam plant running probably 3/4 of the hull essentially below the water.
That's right. Yeah.
Which with Queen Mary 2 you don't need to worry about so much.
No, and on the weight front, the first Queen Mary is fully riveted, so you've got overlapping steel plates with I think 13 million rivets on board the ship, and that's all added weight. Nowadays we weld the plates together, and not only is that vastly superior strength wise, and there have been some tests done, and I think it's over 40% better for strength than being riveted, but you're not carrying around all this extra weight.
Yeah, I mean, how much does a rivet weigh? And if you multiply that by 13 million.
Yeah.
Wow.
But also, as I say, to actually, a lot of these, joints are double riveted. So you've got to have a huge overlap of steel plates to accept the double rivets. So that adds a tremendous amount of extra weight to the ship. Plus, the first Queen Mary, and we're going to talk about that as well, she had 27 boilers. She had 24 standard boilers for the propulsion plant,
Mm.
and she had 3 auxiliary boilers. So that's why she needed the 3 funnels in order to vent from those 27 boilers. But when comparing her to the next ship, the Queen Elizabeth only had 12 boilers.
Mm.
So that enabled them to reduce the number of funnels down to 2. So immediately you've lost the funnel trunk right through the ship, plus all the extra air intakes, those ducts are going to be much reduced. But the Queen Elizabeth's 12 boilers, because they were that much bigger, actually had much less surface area.
Well, all right, let's talk about it. Did you want to touch on anything else with the Queen Mary's design, or shall we move on to Queen Elizabeth?
Let's what we got here. Yeah, air conditioning.
Yes, air conditioning.
Normandy introduced air conditioning on the transatlantic run. Queen Mary took it a stage further, and in fact, when she was built, she had the largest air conditioning plant on a passenger ship. And the first class dining room, the first class lounge, and the tourist dining room, which was basically second class at the time, was air conditioned. So that is where air is taken from the outside, it's dried, a certain amount of moisture is added, and it's either cooled or heated. That's what we call air conditioning. The rest of the ship took the outside air and either heated it or cooled it.
Mm-hmm.
So there was much less conditioning done. So it was basically just ventilation.
Mm.
And that wasn't so bad on the Atlantic. But in summer, and especially what made life difficult when the ship went cruising, as Queen Mary did in the early 1960s, in the hot climes, it made life on board quite unbearable.
Mm. And ultimately, I think Queen Mary was taken off the Southeast Asia theatre during the Second World War and sent pretty hastily back to the Atlantic. Obviously, it tied in pretty well with taking American troops out over to Britain, but I know that it was absolutely miserable when you had 6,000 men crammed into this thing. She was operating in Sydney in summer, which is, 40 degrees Celsius, 90% humidity. Nightmare.
Well, when you think on the Atlantic, she had over 15,000 troops on board.
Obviously, something she was never really designed to do.
No, 2,500 was the normal passenger complement. But another interesting thing here, if you go a little bit aft, Mike, to the veranda restaurant area, you see here the veranda restaurant behind the last lifeboat there. And you see it's a single deck height there, and that was the veranda restaurant. But in her second year of service, on top of that was placed a new deck house for the engineers. And the reason was that the accommodation inside the ship was so cramped for the crew that the engineers revolted, and they had to build a new section of accommodation on top there for the engineers.
So they actually essentially mutinied, is that right?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of complaints.
Wow.
And certainly it must have been effective, because Cunard, built that extra deck house on top, which, must have been expensive to do.
They did pretty well, because essentially they got some of the best real estate on the ship. They got their own apartment block, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, in Long Beach, where the ship is, that has been stripped out, and it's now the Sir Winston's restaurant.
Yeah, there's this huge 2-story ladder running up along the side of it. If you see if the viewers look up in photographs, they'll be able to see that this is much more extensive. It's interesting they did something similar with Normandy in a very similar space. They ended up, that promenade that they had was
awful tourist class lounge that they added on at the aft end to make tourist class more attractive. And I think we have to say that Queen Mary was the only ship of state of the 1930s. So of Europa, Bremen, Normandy, Rex, Conti de Savoia, she was the only one that turned a profit without a government subsidy. All the other ships needed a government subsidy.
Is that partly applicable, or can you subscribe that to, we were talking about the idea of designing a ship as being essentially almost formulaic, where you need a ship this big that can take this many passengers to essentially pay for itself and cover this much coal. Did Cunard, were they better at perfecting the formula and playing within the rules of that formula to create ships that were more profitable?
I don't think it's that so much. I think it's just the popularity of the ship. And Queen Mary always carried more passengers because Normandy, fabulous ship, absolutely, she costs twice as much to build as Queen Mary. And in fact, they're the same size. But first class was extremely lavish. But the other two classes were okay, but Queen Mary's second and third class, or tourist and third, what they called it, was provided much more for passengers. And passengers tended to gravitate in those classes to the Mary. And in fact, a lot of people said they felt uncomfortable on Normandy, even in first class, because it was just too lavish.
Almost like staying in an art gallery.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot to be said for Queen Mary's design. I remember reading that her interior design was kind of panned by a lot of critics when she was introduced, because it was just so eclectic and hodgepodge, but it seemed to work really well.
Yeah, the architectural press slammed the design choices and the decorative features around the ship when she was built. But, Queen Elizabeth didn't have that issue, but QE2 certainly did. That caused a lot of controversy, and so did Queen Mary too. There were people who didn't like that at all, said it was too old-fashioned and everything. So
it was kind of the point. I think that was sort of what I feel like Cunard was going for with Queen Mary 2. It wasn't. I don't think it was meant to be a spaceship on the inside, right?
No, absolutely. We were firmly in the mold to produce something that would have echoes of the first Queen Mary, and that's why the name Queen Mary 2 was chosen. Because Cunard themselves toyed with the idea of calling her Mauritania.
Really?
Yeah, but that was put to Mickey.
Yeah.
And when I was given the job of designing the ship, it was called Project Queen Mary. And he said, no, we'll use the Queen nomenclature for the naming of the Cunard ships. And so Mauritania, but I know there are elements in Cunard that, as we also debated about what the colour scheme should be. Should it be, the green of the Green Goddess?
Coronia, yeah.
And I know Cunard, for an April Fool a few years ago, published a rendering of Queen Mary 2 in the green livery.
Yeah.
To say this is what they were going to do.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it was the right call. Absolutely the right call, because it embodies a spirit, you know, that there's something so, I think first of all it is why Americans love the Queen Mary, and probably partly why they chose to save her. I think if she was called Mauretania 3 or Mauretania 2 at the time, she wouldn't have been anywhere near as popular in America, I don't think, because there's this
no,
love
no,
for
that's
all
right.
things royalty. It's so uniquely British, right? Well, not
Yeah,
obviously not the only royal family in the world, but you know, the Queen Mary has such a strong appeal.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely. And while we're there, Mike, there's the second funnel there. That has a single whistle. The forward funnel has two, but that one has a single whistle, the middle funnel. And they were made in Sweden by a company called Typhon in the early 1930s for the Queen Mary. And we have that middle whistle on board Queen Mary 2. It's the starboard whistle on the ship. We had it reconditioned by Cockham's, and we had a replica made, and we converted them from steam into air. So we have the voice of the original Queen Mary, and I mandated that there's a steam line up to those two whistles that originally blew steam out to make it look as though the whistles were being operated by steam. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be working. But I was surprised to see on Queen Anne, when she blew her whistle, I was sure I saw steam coming out of the whistle. So I think they've done the same thing there.
they like the concept.
They like the concept, yeah.
Anyone
So I
who's been
just
up
hope
there,
they reintroduce it on the Mary too.
yeah, anyone who's been up there when they're testing those whistles can attest to the ground shaking power of those old Typhons. It's that beautiful
Yeah,
deep tone.
10 miles is the audibility.
Unbelievable. Brilliant. I mean, so really this is like an earth-shattering ship. Really, probably the ship that saves the British merchant marine's reputation in the 30s, because they just really
Yeah,
gone through this
absolutely,
nadir.
absolutely. And the design of Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, they were the smallest ships that could operate a weekly transatlantic service. So speed had to go up to 28.5 knots. And they had to, 1,000 tons of fuel a day. So they had to carry enough for the 3-4 day crossing that they would be operating on. 2-3 day turnaround, and then back. And the two ships were able to operate that weekly service that previously 3 ships had operated on.
There was that brilliant quote. I wonder. I think it was. I don't know if it was Percy Bates, but he, after Queen Elizabeth was finished, or I forget which one it was, but he said that actually the ships are the smallest and slowest to practically be able to pull off what we need them to do.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Our friend Sam, who runs a YouTube channel called Historic Travels, has put through a super chat. He says, "Hi Mike, could you ask Stephen if it would be possible theoretically, this is probably a bit of a stretch, but to restore the original Queen Mary so that she is seaworthy again?"
Well, structurally, when you go on the old Queen Mary, a tremendous amount of the internal structure has been removed. A tremendous amount. And there have been concerns whether or not, she's about to sort of implode in herself. But surveys have shown that what remains is still okay. But she wouldn't be able to go to sea again. Definitely not. And the other big problem are all those rules and regulations that we've spoken about. One of the reasons that Queen Elizabeth was pulled out of service in 1968 rather than going on to 75, which was the original plan after the big refit that they did in 65, where they added full air conditioning, added an outdoor swimming pool, added, I think there were 250 extra cabins that they put private facilities. So they did huge reef. 4 months it took in 1965, and she only sailed to 68. Part of the problem was that all the extra regulations that were needed to comply, that the Americans mandated after a fire on the a small cruise ship, the Yarmouth Castle, and Cunard didn't think it was possible to do that. And with Queen Mary as well, as a hotel, some of the staircases are enclosed, so they're not fully open as they would have been when the ship was in service. But there's so many things that you'd have. And, you know, she's still got like salt water flushing, or not, or fresh water they use now, but she was designed to have salt water flush toilets. So it's not like the vacuum system that we employ today. So environmentally and all the different, you know, I wonder how she would fare stability wise, intact and damaged stability, knowing, you know, that she used to be the big roller, and whether or not she would comply on those grounds today. So yeah, no, it's yeah, it would be nice, but it's totally impractical.
Well, and absolutely. I also feel, and this kind of played a little bit into the Titanic replica that was supposedly being made a few years ago now, but the boredom that people would probably endure, what people expect from ships today is constant entertainment. And things were different back then. You had reading and writing rooms, and you had lounges, and you had promenades. And you were expected to while away the days on a deck chair reading. And I don't know that the traveling public, you know, I mean, the sheer amount of things they have to cram into big cruises now to keep
the daily program on the Mary. You know, in the morning there are 4 lectures. There are demonstrations on crafts and cookery, and as you say, there's a myriad of things. Whereas on the old Queens, you were lucky if you got a band, you know, that used to go from one public room to another.
It was just a different mindset, I think, and it reflects in the design of ships.
And in the you used to go on the old Queens because you had to, because as you know, John Maxstone Graham, the celebrated maritime author who's sadly passed away, the only way to cross, you're going on those ships like you would a train or a bus. It's a means of getting A to B. You don't have to go on Queen Mary 2 to get to the States. You can fly, do it in 7-8 hours. So if you do elect to go on Queen Mary 2, you expect to be entertained and to be able to do various things. It's all part of the attraction.
One of my favorite Graham quotes, Maxstone Graham quotes, is what he's talking about, you know, taking a crossing. And he says, I don't know why people will do a crossing and aim to fill every spare minute with some kind of, you know, 3-legged race or bingo when, you know, they're taking their life ashore to sea, when it's the only opportunity you've got to take back then, like 4 or 5 days to not do anything at all.
No, that's right. I mean, when you think that's the Atlantic, but to get out to Australia with P&O or Orient Line used to be 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Until the 50s and 60, when Oriana and Canberra came on stream, it got down to was it 21 days or something? Yeah, shooting along at 27 and a half knots.
That's a whole, and we've that's a whole other thing. We've got a plan to probably talk about that. It'd be great to track the evolution of ships out from, like, say, Multan of 1919 to
Yeah,
Oriana. That's a whole other discussion for another day.
that's
Arlen
right.
D says, "Hello, Mike, his team, and Mr. Payne. I love your videos a lot and your live streams even more. I've been watching you since 2022. Thank you very much. All the best and continued success with greetings from Lindau at Lake Constance in Germany." Thank you very much, Arlen. Very much
Great. Yeah.
appreciate it. We have a very cool global audience who like to tune in to watch these. People from all over the place, which is always extremely touching to think that there are so many people interested from all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, the Queen Mary is kind of the shot heard around the world. There's obviously the infamous running up against Normandy and the constant back and forth, going for the speed records and things. Would you like to talk about the Elizabeth?
Yep. Well, the Elizabeth was a consort to the Queen Mary. A lot of people say it was a sister ship. She's certainly not sister ship, quite a different design. And she was very much influenced by the Normandy, which entered service in 1935, 1 year before the Queen Mary. And she introduced a number of features that really distinguished her. First off, there you see the funnel of Queen Elizabeth, and you notice there are no guy wires. So the funnels were internally supported. So there was a framework inside the funnel, which meant you didn't need all the guy wires. That's the first thing. Secondly, as we briefly mentioned, there's only 12 boilers instead of the 27 on the Queen Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was only today, doing a bit of reading as preparation for this podcast, that I found out a account that said that the Queen Mary's smaller boilers were easier to control than the Queen Elizabeth's large boilers, even though they were much more efficient, Queen Elizabeth's. The smaller boilers were much easier to control. And what Queen Mary did when she entered port for the 2 or 3 day turnaround, they would shut down the propulsion boilers, so the 24 main boilers, and they would operate on the 3 auxiliary boilers to provide steam for the keep the lights on and the galley and things like that. The Elizabeth, they kept 2 of the 12 boilers lit, and that was much more difficult to control, apparently. And but the reason Cunard did that was that it was more efficient, and they used a lot less people to man the engine room. So that was that. Now we look at the bow of the ship, and it's got a much more raked bow.
A nice
than the
hull plan here. I'll just get up while you talk about that, actually.
Okay.
Sorry, unfortunately, these are kind of split. This is the lines plan. So you can see the rake there.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and you see the reason is that she's got that center anchor pocket. They needed the extra rake, so as the anchor fell out of that center pocket, it wouldn't get fouled up by the stem, as it curves around. So she's got a bit more of a racy bow, and that added a few more feet to her length.
It's unusual because the Queen Mary, I don't think had a central anchor. This is kind of like a return to old Board of Trade regulation where you had to have an auxiliary. Is that right?
Well, it could just be with operating experience with the Mary. They felt that it was, Elizabeth was that much bigger, and they might have had. See, Normandy had a center anchor. And as I say, a number of features were copied from Normandy because Normandy had the self-supporting funnels. And the other big thing that Normandy had was, instead of having all those ventilators, it was grouped together at the base of the funnel as just a trunk going down from the base of the funnel alongside the funnel hatch. So you lost a lot less space. It was much easier to arrange the cabin decks, and by having one large duct rather than all these little ones, it was much easier to maintain.
Yeah. Just
now, one
point.
interesting feature here, Mike, if you can go down a little bit to the bottom there, there's that bit jutting, that triangle jutting out there. That's actually, I think, oh no, that is actually the profile of the bow there. So these are sections through the bow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting how much wider and rounder the stem profile is than ships from 20 years earlier, which really were, the stem was like the front of a chisel. It was just so sharp.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that are castings. So nowadays, as far as possible, they try and do it by rolling the plate because the castings are so much more expensive.
To your point about the stem, there's actually a line here. It's a little bit difficult to make out on the plan, but this is the rake of the original Queen Marys. You can actually see a dotted line running down here.
Okay.
And so by comparison, there's, by the looks of it, about 12 feet of additional bow, essentially, forward of where the original Queen Marys would have been, which is quite interesting. So 12 feet raked back in is quite a significant rake there. Yeah.
And of course, you notice there no bulb. So the old-fashioned stem.
That's another one that's really interesting. By the time Queen Elizabeth is laid down, Bremen and Europa and Rex and Normandy have all smashed speed records with bulbous bows, and Cunard doesn't bother.
Well, nobody bothered until 1960 when the Oriana was built.
Was that?
She was the first British passenger ship to have a bulb.
What was it about the bulbous bow that the British merchant industry just wasn't interested in?
Well, there is one, and Oriana was the perfect ship for the bulb because the bulb is optimized for one draft and one trim, and she was very much designed with that in mind. Canberra, they had to put a lot of extra ballast in forward to get her to sit in the water properly because her engines were so far aft. There was a miscalculation and the bow was too far out the water. So they had to add extra forward, which increased her draft, which actually made her bulb less than optimum.
Whoops.
Yeah. Well, the naval architect was a very young guy, John West, and he left P&O after the Canberra. But we'll leave that to when we discuss the P&O and Orient ships.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story.
But no, a bulbous bow is there to reduce the bow wave by forcing the water downwards, and by reducing the bow wave, there's a thing in physics that you don't get something for nothing. So by creating a bow wave and lifting up essentially quite a lot of water, the energy for that has got to come from somewhere, and that manifests from the energy of the ship and so it slows the ship down having a bow wave.
Mm.
So if you can reduce the bow wave to nothing by putting a bulb in front of the ship to send the water going downwards, you can gain 5% increased efficiency.
Mm. But then Cunard does something interesting with Queen Elizabeth, and it might be because it's a post-war thing, but they decide not to run her up against Queen Mary. She never breaks a speed record. She never tries for it.
Well, the explanation that I've heard, I think it's is that the Mary was the blue ribbon ship,
Mm.
and they wanted a sort of handle on Queen Elizabeth so that each ship had a different handle, different reason for going on the ship. And so the Elizabeth was the larger of the ships at 83,000 tons, whereas the Mary was 81.
So they've got both the
But,
fastest and largest ships in one
yeah,
sister or running mate
that's right.
class. Yeah.
So that's the explanation I've heard. But
Mm.
I'm told that Elizabeth was more than capable of beating the Mary
Mm.
with her more efficient boilers and that. Yeah,
Were her boilers superheated? Do you know?
yeah, I think they were.
Okay.
I think I must admit I haven't looked that up, but
Yeah, so I didn't mean to
I'm
put you
sure
on the
they
spot. I
would have
just wasn't
been.
sure.
Yeah, and single reduction geared turbines.
Mm-hmm.
When you think a steam turbine is most efficient when it's running very fast, whereas a propeller is more efficient when it's running slow. And so you've got that mismatch. Well, that's why the early turbine ships like the Mauretania, Lusitania, Aquitania that had direct drive turbines, very, very inefficient. And why you had the excessive vibration, because the propeller theory hadn't advanced to the point where they could really match those disparate requirements. And the French had problems with this because when it came to building the Ile-de-France in 1927, they didn't have a reliable engineering company that could produce the reduction gears. And so Ile-de-France was direct drive. So she retained that very inefficient propulsion system. And when it came to Normandy, they were still worried about the gearing. They didn't want to buy it from the UK. So that's why they went to the electric drive, where you had the turbines running generators that produced the electricity. And then you regulated the speed of the propellers through the electric motors. So the electric motor and the electrical system, in effect, became the gearing. So, yeah.
Yeah, the thought process that goes into it. See, I didn't know that about Ile-de-France. That's fascinating.
Yeah,
It was
and
tried
you
and
think
true.
she lasted to 57, and I think by that time she was the last direct drive turbine ship, certainly passenger ship running, and she would have been hopelessly inefficient.
So does that mean her turbines would have been running at something like 70 odd RPM?
No, the propellers would have been running fast, but
Right.
they got over the, well, they didn't solve the problem, but they were able to live with it by making the turbines excessively large diameter.
Right. So it's essentially the penny farthing arrangement in ship form, where you've got one giant, one giant wheel essentially acting as the gear.
That's right. So, by increasing the diameter, the radial speed, is fast, and that's what you needed for the turbine efficiency.
Yeah.
But it was still far better to have a gearing, and of course QE2 had double reduction gearing, so the turbines could run very fast, and through the double reduction gearing, the propellers was brought down to like the 150 RPM.
That's amazing. I noticed something about the Queen Elizabeth just while we've been talking, but
yeah,
it looks like they might have finally done away with something that the original Queen Mary had that was a real holdover, which was a leadsman's platform. So casting for conducting depth soundings, the
right,
the
okay,
original Queen Mary still had something that Titanic and Mauritania and all those old liners had, which was this little wood platform where you would effectively be able to have a man, casting lead the weight to catch your depth. They were fitted with Lord Kelvin's sounding machines with spars, which would have been their main way, but there was a very quick and efficient way of getting your depth using the platforms. And I think Queen Elizabeth finally did away with it and just relied instead on more modern practices. But it's just funny seeing these holdovers. These are real. It's that design and functionality and the probably the old fashioned redundancies being kind of slowly got rid of by the time these ships come along with built with direction finding and things like that. These advanced navigational systems.
I presume that this plan would have been taken when the ship was rebuilt in 1947 after the war. And of course, during the war, so much was done, things advanced such a lot that they would have been able to incorporate a lot of, depth sounding and all sorts. That had been through wartime developments.
Yeah. You were talking about the deletion of vents, and we kind of get a clue as to where they went here in this view.
Yeah, you see that below the funnel there, you see the great big grills, which are the air intakes, and that runs down the side of the trunk from the funnel itself. So it's a much neater arrangement, takes up much less space, and
big improvement because suddenly you don't need to clutter your deck. It's amazing how much cleaner decks become on ships after that.
Yeah, and I'm always thinking of the practical side of maintaining these ships. When you, as you say, salt air is the most corrosive. You've only got to look side of a ship a couple of weeks after it's been painted, and you already see the rust streaks. Well, just imagine what it's like in those trunks.
Inside, yeah, I've seen some on museum ships. There's one that they're restoring at the moment in Sydney called the Cape Don, which is a beautiful old lighthouse tender. And I was on board one day in the engine room, and the bottom of one of those trunks actually just kind of fell out, and years of corroded steel just poured out, kind of like a little waterfall. And that's a big challenge, that they're working on. They're doing a great job on Cape Don, but it's you can't easily get in there.
No, that's right. One another interesting thing that certainly doesn't happen anymore is that the old queens, Elizabeth and Mary, would dry dock twice a year. Now we have a dry docking every 5 years, and we have wet docks where they take the ship out of service to do refits afloat to like change carpeting or make rearrangements, but actually taking the ship out the water twice a year was a huge commitment to the ship.
Big undertaking.
They actually stopped that in the early 1960s,
right,
when the revenues were dropping so much. They just couldn't afford to do it, basically.
You can build a 1,000-foot long ship. You just have to take care of it afterwards.
Yeah.
So the Queen Elizabeth seems to really take what Queen Mary had kind of done with that beautiful aft superstructure where it just kind of spills deck down by deck down by deck down. And this is something that Queen Mary 2 takes design cues from as well, right?
Yeah. Well, I certainly looked at QE2 and the way her decks cascaded down.
Mm.
And as I said earlier, that a lot of people think that I did that arrangement on Queen Mary 2 to make it look good. Okay, it does that, but the primary reason was to match the weight with the buoyancy along the length of the ship. The aft end, you've got very little ship actually in the water. There's very little buoyancy. And knowing on the Atlantic that there are the swells where the stern is going to be coming in and out of the water. And incidentally, that's why I didn't want a big transom at the stern of the ship. And we have this hybrid stern on Queen Mary called a Costanzi stern. And he was an Italian naval architect who designed the Oceanic and the Eugenio C in the 1960s. And he did this hybrid where you've got a small transom, which is good for hydrodynamic propulsion, merged with the cruiser stern that's good for seakeeping. So as the stern of the ship plunges into the water, you don't get so much banging and force under the transom, and the cruiser stern dissipates the energy, so you don't get this bang and knocking. So that's what we have on Queen Mary 2. And I just wanted to match as far as I could the weight along the length to keep the structural side of the ship, because I wanted the ship to last 40 years without major intervention for structural repairs. As I say, QE2, she needed structural repairs almost from day one.
Yeah, it's future proofing, really. You have to think about the ship not on a maiden voyage, but 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right.
So the Elizabeth probably marks a bit more of a step forward in terms of Cunard pushing the boundaries of ship design. She's obviously borrowed elements from Normandy. Was there anything else you thought that was important to bring up on Queen Elizabeth's design?
Well, she had a much bigger air conditioning plant where more of the public spaces were air conditioned. And when it was decided to use her for cruising in the mid-1960s, the air conditioning was extended to the whole ship, including the crew accommodation. So, as I say, it was a huge investment they made in the ship, and it's so sad that she only lasted 3 years afterwards.
Yeah,
2 years, I think. Yeah, really, really sad.
Never really got
as I
to
say,
reach her
the
full
original
potential.
plan was to run her alongside QE2 for 6 years.
Well, that would have been amazing.
75.
What an amazing sight that would have been.
Yeah.
We've got just a couple of comments from some of the viewers. Eclectic Travel says, Mike, I love your channel. My family immigrated on Queen Mary 2 sorry, why do I keep saying that? Immigrated on Queen Mary in 1962, and I worked as a tour guide in my teens. Finally served on NCL America ships. Hope to sail aboard Queen Mary 2. Thank you, Stephen, for her beautiful design.
Well, thank you very much.
There is a common theme in a lot of these comments, which is that you've essentially done a public service by designing a ship so beautiful.
Well, personal passion, and it wouldn't have been possible without the vision of Mickey Harrison and Howard Frank, because they bought Cunard and basically gave me $1 billion to play with. And it's their intervention originally that's started the process. So we've got to give them due credit for that.
Yeah, they were willing to take that chance, and that's a whole story that we will have to cover when we get to Queen Mary 2.
That's right.
Alexius has got a good question. I know you get asked this a lot because I think I asked you as well, which is, what does the future hold for ocean liners? Queen Mary 2's successor, could it preserve the traditions and classic design elements of historic ocean liners?
Yeah, the thing is, Queen Mary 2, as far as I'm aware, and I'm on the ship 2 or 3, sometimes 4 or 5 times a year on trips, she's always full. So there's a big demand there. Now, Queen Mary 2 is only halfway through her allotted time. As I say, 40 years is the design life. That could be extended to, say, 50, if they want to spend the money on the ship. So a ship to follow on, yeah, I can see there would be the need. The big concern is that to do the Atlantic, you really must have an ocean liner and not a cruise ship. And certainly at the very start of designing Queen Mary 2, Mickey and Howard said to me, well, take a look at the Disney ships, the Disney Magic and the Disney Wonder, I think it was. And, they've got red and black hulls, and they've got the red and black funnels and the black hull, white superstructure. And I said, no, these are cruise ships that are in disguise as liners. And then I showed them the Michelangelo incident that you spoke of earlier. And that crystallized their thoughts. And they said, okay, we're not going to spend this money on a whim. If we invest the money in cruise ships, we're going to make so much from our investment. You've got to design a ship that will do the same. So I had to design a ship that would circumvent that 40% premium from going from a cruise ship to a liner. And the way I did that, as I say, was by massively increasing the proportion of balcony cabins, by bringing the public rooms down and doing what I did. Now, the trick is, all the cruise ships, of course, do that now. And so if you're going to design another liner that's going to be 40%, it's where do you find that other 40% so you can say you're equivalent to the modern day cruise ship? There are a few naval architects, some of which I'm mentoring. There's a young Chilean lad who wrote to me when he was at school, and he's now going through his naval architecture, and he's very keen, very bright. I see him as a possible next Stephen Payne. So who knows?
Wow.
He might, it's possible, but it's the commercial aspect you've got to think of.
Yeah.
As I say, there's no such thing as a perfect ship. And you've got this fine line of looking after shareholders who put the money up to build the ship and what they want in return, and providing what's necessary for passengers. And if you're on the Atlantic, you've got to do it in a safe way.
Yeah. And we were talking about the possibility of nuclear power being able to offset
Yeah,
running costs.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
I've done a study at the Royal Academy of Engineering where we got experts and we did a whole report. And certainly the technology is there.
Mm.
When you think the Americans had the Savannah and the Germans, the Otto Hahn in the 60s, so it was even possible then. Technology has moved on a lot, and you're now talking about these small modular reactors that are going to be built, and derivatives of that could be made available. Submarines have these nuclear reactors that you don't have to refuel them for the lifetime of the submarine. The biggest problem is the public perception that it's dangerous.
Yeah.
With a conventionally powered ship, you burn fuel in a boiler or you burn it in an internal combustion engine. You throw the smoke out the top of the funnel, and there are consequences of global warming and the pollution, particles, and things like that. With nuclear, you've got this nasty reaction happening in a contained environment. And if you're able to contain it and deal with the waste, and obviously that's an important aspect of it all, it should be a real answer to it. But I live 7-8 miles away from Southampton. Southampton has declared itself a nuclear-free zone, so they will not allow a nuclear commercial ship into the port.
Yeah.
The Royal Navy occasionally bring a submarine in, which they can't refuse. It's a nuclear-powered submarine. But the biggest problem is perception. And maybe once these small-scale reactors get the go-ahead and start performing, and there's a track record with that, then maybe that's going to be the answer. A lot of people today are putting a tremendous amount of effort into new fuels, and of course there's LNG gas, which some of the cruise lines are using. That's a good stepping stone, but it's not the answer in total, because it's still a carbon-based fuel that you're adding to the carbon footprint. It's just not producing sulfur dioxide and sulfur problems. Methanol, which is an alcohol that you can make. Okay, there are carbon there and it produces carbon dioxide, but to make the methanol, you're taking carbon dioxide or carbon from the air. So you're just recycling. Another fuel is ammonia.
Right.
And there are pilot schemes with ammonia, with fuel cells and the like. So there's a tremendous amount of work going on. A lot of people are very critical of the marine industry and the cruise industry specifically, saying that we're not doing anything on the environmental front. But in fact, we are. There are very strict reduction, emission reduction. And it's not even targets, they're mandatory. And, you won't see Queen Mary 2 charging around at 29 knots, even if Cunard wanted to operate. It's because they're confined by an operating envelope tied to emissions. And every year they have to demonstrate that they're reducing the emissions of the ship and all the other ships. So there's a lot going on in the background that a lot of uninformed people don't realise.
Yes, there's a lot to consider. It's always interesting to me, the getting your perspective on this stuff, because there are things that the layperson would never even dream that you would have to take into consideration. When we spoke about doing this, I warned you that time was going to fly and we were going to run out of time. And
Yep.
here we are. It's been 2.25 hours, and we are only halfway through the proposed presentation.
That's it.
I knew was going to happen, so I'm totally not phased at all. But what I would love to do is have you back on the channel and pick up the story and take it from Queen Elizabeth to QE2. QE2 probably being the most important leap between the old world and the new, with Queen Mary 2.
Yeah, I think QE2 stroke QM2
Yeah.
would be a good, because absolutely. I think that's the way to go.
It's a little difficult having you on the channel for the first time and then also trying to do a presentation, because inevitably I'm going to have a lot of, fanboy kind of questions. The audience obviously want to pick your brain about so many things.
Yeah.
So I think we've done well, actually, to get... I thought we were just going to talk about Queen Mary and run out of time. I think we've done pretty well to get to Queen Elizabeth and cover all the salient, important points. But if it wouldn't be too much trouble, we'd love to have you back on the channel, because we've been at around 500 viewers, which is not bad considering I didn't realize tonight is the premier sporting event in the US. The Super Bowl is on.
Okay.
Which I had no idea about. So thank you to all 500 of you who've been with us tonight. Maybe you've had the Super Bowl on in one corner of your room. I think personally this is much more interesting, but that's just a personal point of view. But Steve, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on the channel and get to talk about this stuff, because I don't think people realize, beyond being a naval architect and a brilliant engineer, you are also actually a walking encyclopedia of all things that float.
Well, I think that to design something for the future, you've got to have an appreciation of what's happened in the past. And certainly when we get to talk about Queen Mary 2, there are a lot of features that I took from ships of the past, features that I thought would work well on the original ships. The stern, as we've already said, the Costanza stern, it worked well for the Oceanic and the Eugenio, and I proposed it to the French, and they were very skeptical until we did the model tests, and then they said, yeah, this works, let's do it. And that's why Queen Mary 2 has this really unique stern arrangement. It marries the two together for the comfort of the passengers. So yeah, there's a lot. But that's why I'm interested in the history and that. And I'm very, very conscious Queen Mary 2 is the only transatlantic liner running, so she's the sort of flag bearer for all those past transatlantic ships, but specifically Cunard, she's the custodian of the transatlantic route from 1840. And I like to think that everything Cunard has learned and done within that period that I've picked up through reading different things and proposing the design of Queen Mary 2 is embedded in the ship, basically.
Yeah, it's very interesting to get the historical perspective as well. There's so much we could talk about.
Yeah, well, certainly just to sort of whet people's appetite for when we pick up, is that QE2 was designed originally as a 3-class ship and entered service with 2. But within 2 years, they had introduced a subclass, which was basically the grills class, to produce the extra revenue, because the ship was losing money after 2 years. And that system is what's embedded now in the current Cunard fleet, where you've got basically a one-class configuration, but with a grills class in 2 levels, that provides the extra revenue, which is the sort of the cream on the top of the milk, as it were.
Yep, and plays into that whole making the ship profitable,
commercially viable.
Yeah.
As I say, that was the one of the ways Trafalgar House that bought Cunard in 1971. That was one of the ways they turned the ship around and made her profitable. And when you think in the early 70s, you had the fuel crisis where the price of fuel went up 4- or 5-fold. And if they hadn't have done various changes, and we'll talk about that when we talk about QE2, QE2 wouldn't have lasted very long, and that's why the France went out of service in the early 70s, and the Michelangelo and the Raffaello, because they didn't adapt and they weren't able to produce that revenue that was needed to keep the ships in service.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting history coming up in the future.
Yeah.
For us to go over.
Absolutely.
But Stephen, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on. It is usually a tradition that we would redesign a ship at the end of the stream, but unfortunately today we have run out of time because we've had so much ground to cover. I think next time what could be fun is if we budget a little extra time at the end of the stream, and you and I can have a crack at fixing something up. We'll take some audience recommendations. Obviously not Queen Mary 2 because she's perfect as she is, but any other ship.
Yeah, maybe the L'Atlantique, the South America ship, the French one. Yep. I think she could be improved.
She was a bit of an ugly duckling.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's a few choices that we could make. There's a few examples. But it's been absolutely fantastic having you on. This is something I've kind of talked about for a while, but haven't got around to doing. So,
and thank you to everybody who's been listening and will listen in the future. No, it's been great chatting away.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll get to go back and rewatch the stream. You'll see all the comments coming through, but people have been chatting the whole time. And actually, someone called Conchu was going around buying memberships to the channel and ended up buying something like 200 or so memberships for all these different people as a way of saying thank you, and they're enjoying the content. So thank you very much, Conchu, for that
fantastic,
extraordinarily generous display. But thank you again, Stephen. It's been absolutely wonderful. Until next time, my friend.
Okay. Good night, all.
Soon. And everybody, thank you so much for watching us. It's been wonderful to spend the evening with you. Go and enjoy your Sunday nights or your Monday mornings, depending on where you are. As always, stay safe and stay happy, and we will see you again next time.